McCanles looked over the cabin and stable he had owned and maintained for years. He felt pride in the work he put into this property, charging every Mormon, gold seeker, and pioneer on the Oregon Trail a toll for the bridge he had built and the supplies he provided when they stayed the night. Easier to collect money from a poor pioneer than Horace Wellman any day. He wasn't going to let the pathetic little manager of the station tell him the same story again. Not today. Not after months of zero payments from the Overland Stage Company. "Watch this, son," he told the 12-year-old Monroe to his right. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do what I should have done weeks ago. There's no law where there isn't a man strong enough to carry it out." "Where's that coward you always talking about, cousin?" asked James Woods on his left. "You mean Dutch Bill?" "I thought it was Duck Bill," came James Gordon from behind. "Duck lost its flavor. Dutch seems more fitting for Hickok." "I don't get it," returned Gordon. "He's a Yank and he's a coward," said Woods. "Fits him perfect like those other lop-eared Dutch back home." "Let's just hope for his own good Dutch Bill stays out of the way," said McCanles. McCanles motioned for his cousin Woods to stop and hang back with Gordon. "I'm not letting Wellman drag this out, and I don't think he has it in him to put up a fight. All the same, keep us covered, boys." Gordon nodded and set his hand on the butt of his pistol in his belt. Gordon would have felt much better if he could see Hickok. No matter how much McCanles or Woods belittled the stock tender, Bill Hickok was too quiet, too smart, and too good of an aim to forget about. "Maybe we should find Hickok and tell him this affair doesn't involve him," suggested Gordon, looking around the station grounds. "I don't need a bullet in my back." "Relax. This is a legal matter with Wellman." "Dad?" "Yes, son." "Maybe we should go find a marshal." "Monroe, there comes a time in a man's life when he needs to take what is his, no matter the trouble. And when there ain't no marshal within 100 miles, all a man can do is handle his own troubles. Now don't worry, son. I know what I'm doing." In the past 2 episodes, we have been analyzing one of the most controversial gunfights in the Wild West, one clouded in a smokescreen of biased first-hand accounts, sensationalized national articles, and the power of Wild Bill's own legend. We have learned that the first reports that depicted McCanles as a bloodthirsty gang leader were simply part of a false narrative intended to cast Hickok in a heroic light. Rather, McCanles was an enterprising pioneer attempting to create a life and future for his family. Hickok, on the other hand, was just biding his time, waiting to recover from a savage bear attack. While there are discrepancies in the eyewitness testimonies and secondhand accounts about what really happened that fateful day at Rock Creek Station in Nebraska Territory, we are bringing you one of the most accurate, up-to-date, and in-depth reports that has ever been done on the McCanles Massacre, including an often overlooked theory, so that you have access to the truth. And finally, here it is. Having served as a sheriff for several terms back in North Carolina, and without a local sheriff to aid with his grievance, McCanles figured it was his role to take the next legal step of repossession by throwing the current tenants out. McCanles stepped in front of the cabin and yelled to Wellman, "Come outside so we can talk, Horace." Wellman didn't enjoy making excuses for the Overland Stage Company any more than McCanles liked hearing them, and he had no desire doing so outnumbered. And so, Horace Wellman remained inside. McCanles again called out, "If you don't come out here, I'll come in there and drag you out myself." Unsatisfied with the situation's progress, McCanles again demanded that Wellman come out, lest he take him out by force. Now this is the part of the story where Mrs. Wellman enters. We don't know much about Mrs. Wellman other than she was the common-law wife of Horace, and that, based on the morbid events of that day, she had a mighty temper. and when she saw McCanles abuse her husband again, Mrs. Wellman came out of the cabin and met McCanles face to face and tore into him, saying that not only did they not have the money from the company to give him, but she wasn't going to let him barge into their home and manhandle her husband. We can only imagine what else she said after weeks of harassment and threats. McCanles, however, was unfazed by Wellman's female counterpart and again repeated his threat to physically remove Horace if he didn't come out under his own volition. At some point, probably at this moment, Hickok emerged and sent Mrs. Wellman inside so he could attempt to dissuade McCanles and urge him to leave the Wellmans alone. The appearance of Hickok, however, took McCanles by surprise, and according to the acclaimed historian Tom Clavin, McCanles told him, "Mind your own business, Hickok." "I'm making it my own business," Hickok responded. "This ain't your affair, Dutch Bill," McCanles fired back. "Now make yourself useful and convince that coward Wellman to come out and settle his business himself." Hickok indeed returned to the cabin, where Horace paced nervously and Mrs. Wellman was equally distraught and pleaded for Hickok to do something to help them. Hickok assured her that he wouldn't let McCanles and his men abuse her husband or throw them out, so he took his place behind the curtain, separating the station's office from the living area, with a loaded gun in his hand, tipping the scales in the Wellman's favor. Apparently based on his legal right to repossess property in the absence of the law, combined with the fact that McCanles built this very cabin himself just a few years earlier for his brother, McCanles entered the shadow of the cabin door with his son at his side. While there are conflicting accounts about who was armed that day besides Hickok, even the most biased accounts favoring McCanles suggest that he had a shotgun on his person. McCanles used the shotgun in some way to gesture at Wellman to leave the cabin. Whatever Hickok saw from behind that curtain was enough for him to do what he thought was right for his and the Wellman's defense. He lifted his pistol and fired. The lead ball did not miss its mark. True to Hickok's famed accuracy, the bullet went right through McCanles' heart. He dropped to the floor in front of his son. McCanles sat up, looked at his son as if to say something, and then slumped over, dead. Woods and Gordon, upon hearing the gunfighter, rushed into the cabin, pistols in hand, and immediately met lead from Hickok's Navy Colt. These shots, however, were less effective and sent each man stumbling out of the cabin and seeking refuge in the tall grass by the creek. This is where the story takes a gruesome turn that Hickok detractors are quick to point out and sensationalize, and Hickok apologists are at a loss to explain. At least one of the other employees at the Rock Creek station, Doc Brink, the head stock tender, decided it was finally safe to involve himself and assisted Hickok tracking down the fleeing and bleeding James Gordon down to the creek. Either one or both of them snuffed him out at close range. Most accounts say that he was killed with David McCanles' own shotgun. Back at the cabin, according to some accounts, Horace Wellman was emboldened by the killing of his nemesis and took no pity on the mourning 12-year-old Monroe, and reached for the nearest makeshift weapon when swung it at Monroe McCanles' head. Whether to take him out or at least scare him off, no one knows, but Monroe avoided the blow and ran all 3 miles back to his house, informing his mother of the tragic set of events. Meanwhile, James Woods, fatally wounded, continued to drag himself into hiding by the creek, but not unnoticed. Mrs. Wellman came out to survey the scene and saw Woods writhing in the grass. Her vitriol towards the McCanles clan was apparently not satisfied by letting him bleed out in peace, and so took a heavy garden hoe, ran up to the fatally shot McCanles' cousin, and struck him repeatedly in the head until he was in fact dead. Hickok, Wellman, and Brink turned themselves in 3 days later to the local authorities, which consisted of a judge and a makeshift courtroom. Monroe McCanles, the only witness from the McCanles side, was not allowed to testify, leaving only Mrs. Wellman as a witness. The 3 men pleaded not guilty on grounds of self-defense, arguing that McCanles forced his way into the Wellman home. The trial lasted all of 15 minutes. and the judge declared them innocent. For what it's worth, on his way to what the McCanles sympathizers call a sham trial, Hickok stopped by the McCanles home to see Mrs. McCanles. He gave her all the cash he had, $35, and apologized for, quote, having to kill your husband. He wished he had more to give her. And so ended the story of the McCanles Massacre. Is this what really happened that fateful day at Rock Creek Station? While this description is considered the most balanced account of what actually unfolded, supposedly, there is no way to be sure, and the Nebraska Historical Society, in its investigation, made sure to interview as many local first and second-hand citizens as they could. Their testimonies poke holes in many of the details I just recounted, questioning whether McCanles even forced his way into the Wellman home, and stated that, based on Monroe's own testimony as an adult, that neither his father nor the other men were even armed, and that Horace Wellman actually attempted to murder the 12-year-old boy before he escaped. In this report, published in 1968, George W. Hansen, a self-proclaimed pioneer and banker of Fairbury, Nebraska, who spoke himself to living relatives of the victims, wrote that, quote, David McCanles was a victim to the cold-blooded killer of Hickok, end quote. This sentiment is further supported by the fact that Hickok was hiding behind a curtain when he shot McCanles, a detail that Hickok kept a secret, and that the world only learned about from Monroe himself decades later. So, to summarize, first of all, let's set aside the tall tale of the Harper Weekly's report that painted Hickok as a hero in this gunfight and McCanles as a villain out to kill. Remember, despite Hickok's interview to Colonel Nichols that made him famous, later on Hickok refused to speak of this incident because it gave him nightmares. Something truly disturbed him about this event. Whether it was his own actions or simply the way things got out of hand, we can only speculate. Second of all, we can clearly judge that McCanles, despite his other flaws and intentions, was not planning to kill Hickok or the Wellmans. He would not have brought along his son Monroe, and certainly wouldn't have spent so much time verbally trying to persuade Horace Wellman to come out of the cabin and negotiate with him directly. McCanles, after all, was an entrepreneur, a homesteader, a businessman, someone who expected others to work with him. Thirdly, it is clear that McCanles was, in fact, a bully, a Southern sympathizer, and a man who had no love for Hickok. There is enough evidence to suggest that both men fought for the affections of a flirtatious single woman living on her own between their two properties, and that McCanles wasn't going to be shown up by a younger, awkward-looking man. Upon reflection, the McCanles Massacre shows the future Prince of Pistoliers acting on his moral and fearless nature to fill a vacuum lacking law and order. A man with quiet confidence, exceptional gun skills, and an intolerance to see anyone being mistreated, who dealt out violence like he played cards, using a poker face at all times and waiting for the other person's tell. Hickok knew when to call someone's bluff, as he did that day when McCanles made the mistake of walking into the cabin, forcing Hickok to play his own pistol-equipped hand. In the aftermath, the details of the gunfight spread quickly, growing more elaborate with each telling. Hickok's role in the deadly encounter became a defining moment in his life, propelling him towards a mythic status. The McCanles family, marked by their tragic loss, faded into the shadowy recesses of frontier history. For Hickok, the gunfight at Rock Creek Station was just the beginning. The echoes of that day would follow him, shaping the legend of a man whose name would forever be synonymous with the untamed spirit of the American West. If you enjoyed the analysis of this historic gunfight, click the link below to learn about the historical novel I have written about the McCanles Massacre, an edge-of-your-seat book that dramatizes all of the action, romance, and violence of this bloody tale. And if you want a grander take on Wild Bill Hickok, click the other link to learn about Deadman's Hand, a book and movie we are working on that covers Hickok's entire legendary life. And most importantly, don't forget, the West lives on as long as you have hope, courage, and a restless hunger for adventure. Thanks for listening.